cryptography, pseudo-random number generation. So she was also a speaker at the 1990 International Congress of Mathematicians, and she's a fellow of the AAAS and the AMS and the Association of Women in Mathematics, as well as the American Academy of Science. So, Lenore, thank you.
Okay, so everybody can see my screen? Yes? Okay, thanks, Maya, and for the introduction, and also for inviting me and the other organizers. And I'd like to thank Melanie and Billy for their excellent talks this morning on consciousness. So I'm going to come from a different perspective. So I'm going to look at a theoretical computer science lens on consciousness. Let's see. Can't move my slides. Okay, let's see what's going on here. So I got it. I can't look at the screen and move my slides. So I've got to move this around.
Yeah, so we're still on the first slide.
Yeah, but I can't move it. So I'm not going to leave the meeting, and I want to go to view standard. No, I want to move everything over. Yes, there's something peculiar happening here. I can't move my own slides. So let's see if I can do it now. Okay, can you see my slide now still?
I see your first slide still.
Okay, and now you see my second.
Now you're, yes, that's right.
But finally, great. Okay, so I'm back on my slides. Hi, everybody. Sorry I can't be there in person. Okay, so this is a theoretical computer science lens on consciousness, and this is joint work with Manuel Blum and Avram Blum, who is our in-house machine learning expert here. So it's a family affair. So theoretical computer science is a branch of mathematics that studies computation given limited resources, time, space. It differs from the classical Turing theory, which assumes these resources are unbounded. So we're really looking at constrained resources. And mathematics differs from other methods used in science because it abstracts and it formalizes informal notions, it proposes axioms, and it derives results. And what we want to do here is to construct a simple formal mathematical model that at a high level will exhibit and explain phenomena associated with human consciousness, will also align with and integrate underlying principles of major theories of consciousness, and will answer questions that a theory of consciousness should encompass. Okay, so we're inspired, the conscious Turing machine, which I'll talk about, is inspired by Alan Turing's simple yet powerful theory of computation. And here we have a simple 23-state universal Turing machine, which can compute as much as you can compute in cloud computing or a supercomputer. And even what you can compute in ChatGPT, you could already compute it on this universal Turing machine. So we are also inspired by Bernard Barr's global workspace theory of consciousness, which he calls the theater model. And in the theater model, consciousness is the activity of actors in a play performing on the stage of working or short-term memory. And their performance is under observation by a huge audience of powerful unconscious processors in long-term memory that are sitting in the dark. And so that's the audience, very powerful processors. And these unconscious processors, powerful, vie amongst themselves to get their scripts or their query information on stage to be broadcast down to the audience. So let me give you an example of the theater model in action. And many people have had this experience, perhaps you have. You're at a party and you see somebody you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember their name. Wonder if that's happened to you. But then on the way home, you're driving, and when you get home, her name pops up. So what's going on? So there's some processor sitting in that audience, unconscious processor, that is very embarrassed that you couldn't remember her name and puts in the competition the question, what's her name? What's her name? And that gets up into the stage to short-term memory and gets broadcast down. And another processor recalls where you first met, perhaps at a conference at Berkeley on computation and neuroscience. That gets up to short-term memory on stage. It gets broadcast. Now, the processors have a little bit more information, but something about what she does. Well, she's a psychologist interested in computation, gets up to the stage, gets broadcast down. Now the processors are speculating. Her name begins with S. That goes up to the stage, gets broadcast down. And a half hour later, her name, Noga, comes up to the stage, to the conscious STM from the audience of unconscious processes, which have been thinking, searching. Now, Noga doesn't start with S, and we'll come back to this later, what happened here. So remember that. But the conscious self, the onstage person, is not privy to the workings of the unconscious self. Okay, so before I go ahead with the description of the conscious Turing machine, I'd like to say what it is not. So it's not a standard Turing machine. What gives the conscious Turing machine its feeling of consciousness is not its input-output map, nor its computing power, but what's under the hood. And I'd like to talk about what's under the hood. It's also not a standard global workspace model. It's a formal mathematical model. It has a well-defined competition. So generally, it's stated that these audience members vie amongst themselves to get their information on stage. We have a well-defined competition. The other huge difference is that the CTM has no central executive. Every global workspace model we know of has a central executive. We do not. And that makes it actually a good model for AGI, artificial general intelligence. I'll go into that for a little bit. And the subjective feelings of consciousness in the CTM arise from the coevolution of brainish, which is CTM self-generated multi-model internal language, and its model of the world. So in these ways, it will differ significantly from a global workspace model. And finally, it is definitely not a model of the brain. It's way too simple for that. Okay, so what I'd like to do in this talk is, first of all, give you an overview of the conscious Turing machine, its frameworks. You may think of these as specs for a construction of such a machine. Then I'd like to define conscious attention in the CTM. And this is generally, conscious attention is analogous somewhat to what people call access consciousness. And we'll talk about the global broadcast axiom here. And then I'll talk about some insights coming from conscious attention. But then I'd like to go ahead and talk about conscious awareness. And this is usually called subjective consciousness or phenomenal consciousness. And that will have another axiom 2 here. And this will depend on the coevolution of brainish and the model of the world in CTM. And then I'd like to talk about the alignment of CTM with other theories of consciousness and maybe mention possible tests for consciousness. Okay, so formally, the CTM is defined by a 7-tuple, STM, LTM, up tree, down tree, links, input, output. Time is measured in discrete clock ticks, t equals 0, 1 up to 10 to the 10th. So it has finite lifetime. It's born at time 0. CTM has a finite lifetime, 10 to the 10th. And then we go into specific details of each of these components, STM, LTM, up tree, down tree, etc. And I'm not going to do this formally for you. What I'm going to do is give you a cartoon sketch. So here's a cartoon sketch of the conscious Turing machine. And we start with STM. This is short-term memory. It's our conscious stage. And it's very small. It's really like a broadcast system. And this stage can hold one chunk of information. It's not the 7 plus a 2 chunks that George Miller talked about, the magic number, but we're trying to, for simplicity and for our purposes, one chunk will do. So one chunk of information at any moment of time in short-term memory on stage. And then we have a huge audience of unconscious processors. These are very powerful processors. We're assuming about 10 to the seventh of these processors, somewhat like the 10 to the seventh cortical columns in the brain. And because we're going to look at a binary tree, we're going to look at 2 to the 24th. It's a little bit more accounting for other processors that we might have. These processors, to start with, are unlinked to start with. And one reason for that, if everything's linked together, we would have 10 to the 14th links, pairs of links, which is just an enormous number that will be totally unmanageable. So links will form over time, and I'll talk about how that happens in a bit. Okay. And also, for simplicity, we're going to assume that all processes are in LTM. So there could be other processes for memory and stuff. Everything is in LTM, all the processors. And again, as I mentioned, all processes are linked. They're independent at first. And built into each long-term processor, T equals 0, are some predictive learning algorithms. I'll mention this later. These are called Blum's sleeping experts algorithm, and they have to do with balancing weights that processors give to their information. Now, you have to think of these processors as processors. They're not neurons. They're not models of neurons. These are processors, so very high-level processors. And to start, we have only a few designated processors that have specific functions. So we have input processors. You can think of those as sensory processors. We have output processors. You can think of those as motor processors. And we have gauge processors. You might call those homeostats, for example, having a fuel gauge. But all the other processors start off as powerful but generic. Each processor has its own internal language, but processors communicate within the CTM in a language we call Brainish, and this is CTM self-generated multimodal language, and I'll indicate how this develops later on. And your CTM's Brainish is different than my CTM's Brainish, so Brainish will evolve over time in the particular CTM we're talking about. And what Brainish does is it fuses words, images, sounds, smells, sensations. So, for example, a Brainish label for a rose might be a fusion of the red color, the sweet smell, the soft touch of a petal. These senses are fused together. It's multisensory language. Okay, so I've said what STM is, LTM is the uptree. So the uptree is the conduit for an uptree competition. And at each moment in time, each processor puts a chunk into the leaf of a perfect binary uptree. So for simplicity, we're going to look at a perfect binary uptree, which is our conduit for this competition. And the competition is a little like a tennis tournament. When the processors put chunks into the competition, at the first level, the neighbors those chunks play with each other, and then they go up, the winner goes up one level and keeps on moving up and up. So that's how this competition sort of works. And in the literature, chunks are often defined very informally. It's sometimes said as a little bit of information, maybe words of a paragraph of a sentence in a poem or such. So we're going to define chunk very, very formally here. And a chunk will be a 4-tuple plus some auxiliary information. It'll start out with the address of the processor. So if there are 10 to the 7th processor, that address is like a 7-digit number. The time is maybe a 10-digit number. What the gist is a succinct information in Brainish. So because it's in Brainish, it's multimodal information, and you can think of it just like a frame in a dream. So when you're dreaming, you have a a picture with somebody with a colorful scene, maybe roses there, somebody's talking or singing, which you can hear. You smell the rose, and then you see a dog coming along, and you might get a little afraid, so you feel a little afraid. So this succinct information in brainish is sort of like like a frame in a dream. Okay, then the weight is the importance, the value of the confidence that the processor P is giving to the gist, and it's a valenced weight, so it could be positive or negative. And the auxiliary information that we generally use, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it starts off as the intensity, and that's the absolute value of the weight, and it starts off what we call the mood, which is just the weight, so that's the valence number. And as the chunk moves up the competition tree, what's going to happen is the first four parameters are going to stay the same, but the auxiliary information will change. And that auxiliary information will gather more and more global information as the chunk moves up the competition. Okay, so we were trying very, very hard to have our CTM deterministic. We were really trying to have it deterministic. But when we were going through the competition and everything properties that we wanted, we could get them, but they were so hard to get. They're very hard to explain, and we had to add so much more machinery to get it that we were sort of forced to add some probability. So we added what we call a coin flip neuron at each node. And so what the coin flip neuron does, it takes two non-negative numbers, A and B, and will output A with probability A over A plus B, and it will output B with probability 1 minus A over A plus B, and if they're both 0, it's half and half. So now we go to the probabilistic CTM from now on. We have this coin toss neuron. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little sketch of the competition that we use, because it's very simple, but we needed to formulate a nice, simple competition that would get information from the long-term memory processors, and the winning one getting up to the stage. So here I have ABC. I think I have 8 processors share A through H, and you can think of them as players in a tennis tournament. And they've given arbitrary random weights. We've given random weights to their chunk, 314.15962. I'm going to look at processor H as we go ahead. Okay, so these are the absolute values of the weights that these processors have assigned to their chunks. And the sum of these, and these are the absolute values, so there's intensities, and the sum of the intensities here is 31, and we would like the probability of winning the tournament to just depend on the initial intensities over the sum of the intensities. So we'd like A to win with a probability of 3 over 31, and we'd like H to win with a probability of 6 over 31. Okay, so we're going to watch what happens to H if it was going to go up the competition. So H puts its chunk into the competition, and it competes with G's chunk, which has a weight of 2. And then those weights, those intensities are going to go into the coin flip neuron, and the probability that H will win the first round, so we're just going to look at intensity. So the intensity of 6 over the sum of the intensities, 2 plus 6, will be 6/8. This is when it comes out of the coin toss neuron. So the probability of H winning the first round would be 6 over 8. Okay, and as I said, the auxiliary information is going to change at each stage, and we have what we call the winner-take-all competition, and the intensity will be the sum of the intensities before. So at the beginning, that 3 and 1 will be 4, and then that's 5 and 14. And the new intensity at this level of the chunk is now 8. Now let's look at the probability of H winning the next round. We're going to look at the sum of the intensities. That's 14 plus 8 is 22. And so the probability of H winning is 8 over 22. And then the winner gets, it's a winner take all. The winner's going to get all the intensities are going to be the sum. So we're going to have 9 over there, and we're going to have 22 over here. And then the probability of H winning the next round will be 22 over the sum. 22 plus 9 is 31, which we're putting it into the coin toss neuron. And now the new intensity of the winner is, so it'll be H's chunk, but its intensity now will be 31, not 6. So that was the only thing that was changing. So we'll call that sum capital intensity. The sum of the initial intensities will be the capital intensities, that's 31. And that's a parameter that we will use also in evaluating what we have. Okay, so now let's check what the probability of H winning the tournament is. Well, it's the probability that it wins at the first level, which is 6 over 8, and it's the probability that it wins over the next level, and it's 8 over 22, and it's the probability of winning at the last level, 22 over 31, and then you can see the 8's canceling, the 22's canceling, and then we have 6 over 31, and that's exactly what we wanted. So in other words, we essentially have proved a theorem here that the probability of winning depends only on the initial absolute value of the weight that the processor gave to its chunk over the sum of the intensities, or the sum of the absolute values of the weights. Okay, on how the chunk's initial ranking, if you're thinking of these absolute values as a ranking in a tennis tournament, compares with all the 10 million competitors' rankings. Okay, so one question that we get is, why not just calculate the probabilities at the start, okay, if that's what we want? And no, we can't do that. Each processor would need to know the 10 million other weights that were given by the processors, and it just has very local information. It has no knowledge of all the other processors. So this is a very quick way of this binary uptree competition, winner take all, is a very quick way of getting, in fact, the information. So for example, if we have, I said we had 10 to the 7th, which was 2 to the 24th is a little larger than 10 to the 7th. If that was the number of processors we had, 2 to the, I think it's 24, I think that was what it was, 2 to the 24, you can correct me on that. Then the height's just the log of that. So the height is just 24 levels. So it's a very quick competition going up 24 levels. Okay, so a corollary to this theorem is that the competition is independent of the processor's location, which is a really important property for us because we don't want to have to move our processes around in our head for each new competition, and we don't want to have to do this if we're going to make an AI or a machine to do this. So this is important to have independent of the processor's location. There's another question that sometimes comes up: why not just take the maximum of the intensities? And the trouble with that is that if two intensities are close to each other, the one that's slightly lower will never get a chance to win. Okay, and you can see all the problems with that too. So our competition is really it's fairer actually than a tennis tournament. If I'm partnered with some excellent tennis player out there, too bad for me, I'll lose it right at the first level. So this is a very fast and fair competition. Okay. So now here's another question that often comes up. What prevents processors from hogging the stage? So if it's going to be their intensity over the sum of the intensities, why not just keep on putting more and more and more weights or positive of intensities to their chunks? And this is where the built-in sleeping experts algorithm comes in. And what the sleeping expert algorithm does, and it's built into all processors, it's a way of managing the weights so we can't hog the stage. So for example, if you remember the what's her name example, and there was one processor that said her name started with S, and that was wrong because her name was Noga, said S, its sleeping expert algorithm will say, hey, you were too egotistical. You put too much weight. You were wrong. We found out you were wrong. Lower the weights you give next time. Lower the absolute values of the weights you give next time. And then there might have been a processor who actually had the right initial name, the initial of her name as N, and that processor didn't put enough weight to its chunk, didn't get into short-term memory, and its sleeping expert algorithm will tell it, hey, you were too timid, you didn't give enough weight, but you were right. Next time, try raising the weights you give to your chunks. Okay, so the sleeping expert algorithm really is a way of adjusting weights in a reasonable manner. Okay, so one thing about this uptake competition, we don't have a central executive making this decision. There's no central executive there that's deciding who's the winner. All other or most other, I haven't seen another global workspace model that doesn't have a central executive, but this particular model, we do not have a central executive. Actually, the competition takes the place of the central executive. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, a paper came out in the Journal of Neuroscience saying no central executive decision formulation through multi-area population dynamics. And this is one of the first papers I've ever seen in neuroscience, which is really suggesting there is no central executive. And I want to thank Luis Pessoa for alerting me to this on a Blue Sky. And we've had some conversations since, so this has been very, very useful information. And in this paper, they say classic studies suggest that perceptual decisions emerge from a feed-forward hierarchy of brain areas. However, more recent findings argue that decisions emerge from distributed recurrent computations across many brain areas. Okay, so the downtree is the conduit for the global broadcasting. So the uptree took H ticks to go up, and the downtree will take 1 tick to globally broadcast the winner. So what happens here is when we have a winning chunk, it's in short-term memory, and it's immediately broadcast in 1 tick to all long-term memory processors. And the distributed and fair competition, together with global broadcasting, enables creative participation of unexpected talents, making it a good model for AGI. So again, if we had a central executive, that central executive to solve problems would have to be omnipotent and know what all processes were capable of or had time to do things to solve problems. It would also possibly be very biased. And so it would not enable the creative participation of unexpected talents. Okay, so for example, since I'm a theoretical computer science and one of the big problems is, does P equal NP? Maybe there's a processor here in my CTM that's a TCS processor and asks the question, does P equal NP? Puts a high weight on that. With high probability, it will get into short-term memory, then it will be broadcast down. And then there's a philosophy expert processor says, well, mathematicians often look at problems in new domains. Okay, and that gets up into short-term memory and gets broadcast. And then a math expert processor says, great idea, let's try to reformulate it over an arbitrary ring or field. And that gets up there. And another algebraic geometry processor says, let's reformulate the question over the complex numbers about solutions of polynomial equations. And let's reformulate it. Is there a fast method to tell if an algebraic variety is not empty? And if people know some of my work, I worked in that area, but by the way. But anyway, this is a way of actually getting more and more processors involved in solutions and processes that you might not know have the expertise or the interest to become involved, and then coalitions to form. Okay. So we're going to make our first formal definition here, and we're going to say that conscious attention in the CTM is the reception at time t plus h plus 1 by all long-term memory processors of the global broadcast of the winner at t plus h. So t was the time all of the processors submitted chunks to the competition, took h steps to h ticks to get up to short-term memory, one more to get broadcast. Okay, and the winning chunk actually is interesting that gets broadcast because it conveys to all the processors a significant amount of information. Well, first of all, it conveys which processor, the address of the processor that submitted the winning chunk. So we have some information about this processor P. We get the gist that was submitted, the winning gist, like her name was Noga. We get the weight that the processor, that this case was positive weight and was high weight. And then we get the sum of the intensity. So we know something about the sum because that's being collected as we're going up the competition tree. The intensities are gathering more and more of till finally it gets the sum of all the intensities. So everybody knows in a way where they fit in. If you take the intensities divided by n, they get the average intensities. And we have another parameter which we call mood, and that gives something like the global mood of the CTM at the time the processors put in the chunk. And then each processor, when they get the global information, can tell how their mood maybe fit in with the all processors mood. And we have other methods of the competition which actually make use of the intensity and the mood in a more subtle way than I've described here. But basically, it's a similar idea, but slightly more subtle. Actually, we can see something like what's called the Libet effect. There is a delay between submission of the winner and the global reception. Okay, so it takes, when the winning chunk was put in, it was put in at time t, but we only got it at time t plus h plus 1. So there is a somewhat, I think in humans, the delay is like 200 milliseconds, 250 milliseconds. And if we calibrate things right, there's a similar order of magnitude in our CTM. And now we're going to give our first axiom for CTM, and we say conscious attention evokes in CTM a unitary experience when all these processors get the same information that's been broadcast at the same time. And we call that our global broadcast axiom for conscious attention. So let me say a few more words about what's built into all LTM processors. Processors store all chunks that are entered, that they've ever entered. We call that their local dictionary. But for the moment, more important for us right now is that processors store all broadcasted chunks, which we call the global dictionary. So all processors have a common global dictionary. They have different local dictionaries, but they have a common global dictionary. There are triggers built in. If a broadcasted chunk has a very high weight, absolute value weight greater than a certain threshold, then a trigger is that all processors must go deeper into the chunks that they've received, and I'll define that in a bit. And if that weight is negative, all processes must try to reduce extreme negativity. So if the weight that was broadcast is very high negative weight, then all processes must try to reduce that. And we'll see how that comes in also. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that processes aren't linked, and we could link every processor pairwise, and that would be maybe 10 to the 14th links. And so what we're going to do something differently. We're going to have a Hebbian-like principle that, and in this case, it's processes that broadcast together, link together. So we'll have at most maybe 10 to the 10th links, not 10 to the 14th links. So something that's manageable for us. And what links do is it turns slow conscious communication, well, relatively slow, it has to go, information that has to go through short-term memory into fast unconscious communication. So for example, when you learn to ride a bike, all of your movements and everything go through short-term memory, everything that you do. But once you learn to ride a bike, most of it's unconscious. You're riding, except of course, if a car is coming toward you, then you have to either instinctively do something or figure out what to do. Okay, finally, I want to say that the CTM is not a brain in isolation. It's a robot with a CTM brain. So there's input coming from the external world through sensors like eyes, ears, nose, touch, going to some input processors, sensory processors, and there's output going from output processors like motor processors to actuators like limbs or speech or whatever to the external world and to affect the external world. Okay. So we have some kind of full cycles going on here. So in the CTM, globally and locally, we have something we call predictive dynamics, and these are cycles of prediction, feedback, and correction learning. And so a major goal of CTM is to ensure that all predictions it makes are as accurate as possible, and processes make predictions when they turn raw sensory inputs into chunks. It's a kind of analog to digital conversion. Put chunks into the competition, send information over links, transfer chunks into raw outputs, a kind of digital analog conversion. They get feedback from broadcast, from inputs to CTM and through links. And a learning correcting takes place within the processor. Sleeping experts learning algorithm adjusts the weights. Each processor gives it's a balancing algorithm due to Blum. Okay, so that's it. So I've gone through the overview and conscious attention. Now I'd like to look, before we go ahead, at some of the insights that we can get, even at this stage, from the CTM. Okay, I've already mentioned the libet. There's a delay between before a decision is made, before a decision becomes conscious. A decision is made earlier, and then T plus H plus 1 steps later, it becomes conscious, the decision. Okay, so I want to give some insights on how CTM experiences some phenomena that's often associated with consciousness and give high-level explanations that somehow align with some of the neuroscience. And so the reasonableness of our definitions and axioms lie in the number of phenomena associated with conscious that this simple model can exhibit, explain easily and naturally, and agrees at a high level with cognitive neuroscience explanations. And I'm going to look at blind sight, inattentional blindness, and change blindness. So So this is what happens blind sight, we call it type 1. A man is asked to go to the other room, and then he says, but I can't see. Nevertheless, he gets up and avoids all the obstacle and goes to the other room. So this, what's going on? What is CTM? How does it's doing this? Well, our explanation from CTM is that the vision process is probably working more or less properly, and it's going to send a message via link to the motor processor, which sends a message to the walk actuator, and the guy walks. But the connection from vision to STM is broken, or the vision's weight assigning function is broken. Something's broken there. So no information is going straight up to SDM to be broadcast. So without the vision processor having access to SDM, the CTM has no conscious sense that he can see. There's no conscious attention. It's not broadcast. It's done through links. And that's an explanation. And there is some high-level alignment with some of the neuroscience literature. Blind sight relies on functional connections between one area of the brain and another, not the pulse nerve. So that's one thing. And we have kind of a prediction. I've asked a number of people who work in blind sight, have you ever met a person who is blindsided who was not sighted beforehand? So in our particular explanation here, we require that a link had formed between the vision and the motor processor. And I haven't been able to get a straight answer on this, whether somebody is blindsided from birth. And that's different than echolocation. Different. Okay, so let's see another example in attentional blindness. And this is a very famous film where the viewers of the film were asked to count how many times white-shirted players pass the ball. And they're usually okay. They say about 15. But the big question is, but did you see the gorilla? Okay, and here's the gorilla here. Okay, and so our explanation is when the CTM is given a task to look for, higher weights are given to the task, and the CTM might not be conscious of other things in the picture that have lower weights. So high weights are given to things that it sees as white, that gets up into short-term memory. It's not looking for black things, so black information is given very low weights, probably not getting into short-term memory. Maybe sometimes it does, and some people might see that gorilla. But basically, it's a matter of the weights that are being given. That's the unintentional blindness. You're looking for what you've been asked to see. And that's our explanation. And again, it's sort of consistent with the Simons and Chablis who actually initiated this film. It's a very popular, very well-known film in psychology classes. And here's another film that's well-known in psychology classes also. It's the James blindness effect, and it's the whodunit film, and a detective comes into a room and he says, clearly somebody in this room has murdered Lord Smythe. Each of you tell me your whereabouts. There's this dead guy on the floor. And then he goes and interrogates different people. And the maid says, I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom. And the butler says, I was buttering his lordship's scones. And Lady Smythe says, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed. And then immediately this very smart constable says, arrest Lady Smythe. And she says, well, but how did you know? And then he says, Madam, as any horticulturalist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May. Okay. But there's another mystery. How observant were you? And here's this final scene. Here you see the dead guy on the floor and the detective who came in. But if you go back to the initial scene, you'll see that the detective has changed his clothes. And the dead guy, and those flowers have changed too, and the dead guy has changed his clothes as well. And his knee is off the floor, and then there are just a zillion other changes that have been made. So what's going on? Why didn't the CTM see the many changes? Well, our explanation is they had the same gist. The scene is the living room of a mansion with butler, maid, and detective, and a maid laid out on the floor. And so the same gist describes, the same succinct gist describes both scenes. Now, this is happening in the CTM. It's also happening in us. Why do we need the gist to be succinct? Well, one of the reasons is we want our competition and all the computations we make to be very fast. So the gist can't be very, very large if those competition, if all the computations we're doing in our machine are fast. Okay. To get up into short-term memory and to be broadcast, we want everybody, all the processes, to focus on the same thing. That's why the whole chunk has to be very small, because we want every processor to focus on the same thing. And this is coming up very strongly in the change blindness example, where mainly what we've kept in short-term memory from the initial scene is the living room of a mansion with butler, maid, and detective, and a man laid out on the floor. And this explanation is consistent with literature on change blindness in humans. Okay. So what I find interesting is the four examples I've given you are using different things. The Libet used the fact that there was a delay between decisions being made and being conscious of it. The blind site, the role played by links, if the access to short-term memory is impeded. In intentional blindness, the notion that the power effects of the weights that the processors give to their information, their chunks, and change blindness, that brainish gists are necessarily succinct, different aspects of the chunk and our CTN. Okay, but now you would say, and you should say, why would a robot with a CTM brain feel conscious? Or how or will CTM have phenomenal experience, subjective feelings? So we see a lot about attention, and I think that that's a very valid part of consciousness. But as IIT is doing, it's focusing on this aspect, perhaps more importantly. Okay, and what I'd like to say that here for our model, attention is not all you need. So what we need is the coevolution in the CTM of brainish. This is our multimodal language, internal language, and the model of the world. So I'm going to indicate to you how this happens in the CTM. So we'll look at the CTM from the point of view of the model of the world processor. And the model of the world processor maintains models of the world and of CTM in these worlds. And the model of the world processor is widely distributed across the LTM. And in fact, in our formal model, it becomes part of every single processor, every single LTM processor. And what the model of the world processor does is labels sketches in the models of the world it creates with multimodal brainish gists, including labeling sketches of actuators as self when the CTM consistently detects the actuators carrying out its request. Okay, so here's a little example of a baby who's discovering his left leg. And his model world is now seeing that is actually labeling its left leg as self. You can see the baby is actually trying to look at its right leg, can't quite do it yet, so it hasn't yet labeled it as self. It's trying to see if it could do it, but not quite yet. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit more of how this model of the world develops and how brainish develops. Okay. So the newborn CTM starts out with a very foggy model of the world. Okay, that's how it starts out. And there is going to be a first broadcasted chunk. Okay, where those chunks start to be broadcast. And let's say the very first broadcasted chunk starts out with some processor P0 at time 0, puts in a nil gist, it doesn't have any words yet, with some weight W0 and some auxiliary stuff, but I'm not going to put in auxiliary information now. And we'll call that chunk the initial sketch. Okay? And sketches in general will be such broadcasted chunks. And we'll say the brainish name of the initial sketch is the first two parameters here, P00. And in English, we'll call that blob 0. So that's the brainish name for that sketch. And so brainish words will be actually such pointers. So P00 is a pointer to a whole chunk. And that chunk will have a gist in it to start out with. It's just nil, but it'll have more information as time goes by. And remember, these chunks are, because the broadcasts are being collected in the global dictionary that all processors have. So brainish words will be such pointers. PT, which is small, PT is small. The chunk will be larger because even though the gist is small, it's going to be more significant than just PT. So you can think of as PT as the word, and the one on the right, which is in a dictionary, is the meaning of the word. So that's how we think of this. And shortly, a primal word for pain will be created. And let me show you how this happens in the CTM. So if you've ever, and many of you have, if you're doctors, nurses, been in or had a baby, been there when a newborn is born, and the newborn cries, and everybody is happy. Why is everyone happy when this baby is crying? Okay. Well, what's going on in the CTM, or in the baby, the oxygen gauge, so that's one of the gauges, raises its concern for lack of OT and puts into the competition a sequence of chunks having negatively balanced weights of increasingly high absolute value. So this oxygen gauge is putting in chunks into the competition. I need oxygen. I need oxygen. I need oxygen with high negative weights. And eventually that'll get into the short-term memory. It will win and are broadcasting, signaling an increasingly desperate scream, do something. Now, as I said, built into all processors that if there's a high weight and it's negative, they must do something to lower the weight. Then these processors, to start out, do not know what to do. They just do what they do. The arms and legs flail, the infant pees and poos, and the vocal actuator screams and cries, and lo and behold, that last one works. The cry opens the lungs, the infant takes the first breath, and the oxygen gauge starts to lower its weight. Okay? So that's sort of what happens at the beginning. So now suppose the oxygen gauge's chunk that it put in that got broadcast was P1 was the address of the oxygen gauge at time T1. It still didn't really have words. It put in nil with weight 1, which is negative, but very, very high absolute value. Okay. And we're going to call that word, which I'm saying P1, T1, that's the word for the meaning over on the other side. We're going to call that word pain 1 in English. And that will be the primal brainish word for pain. And a brainish gist is just a string of, we're going to say at most 10 brainish words. Probably we should just say 2, but say 10. And so we have our first brainish gist to talk about. It's just a succinct phrase. And I'll put those two words together. So it's P00 together with P1, T1. And let's translate that into English. Remember that the first one was blob 0, and the second one was pain 1. And that just says, indicates that blob 0 is in pain. So that's just a sentence. Now, that's just the words. But to get the feelings, and this is going to come into our inspection, what the CTM's got to do is got to inspect those words. It's got to go to the meanings and relive that pain 1. It's got to relive it to actually get the feeling. And we're going to come to that in a few minutes. But right now we just have the brainish words, and they're sort of like these labels, and maybe they're labels of qualia, whatever. I'm not going to go into that right now. But what was really interesting to me is last summer, a paper came out by some computer scientists at Harvard and neuroscientist Elefete at MIT, and looking at the connection between what's happening in transformers and what's happening in the brain. Elefete is a neuroscientist who has been looking at the brain a lot. And what they say is our goal is to connect the dots between conceptualization of memory retrieval in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning. Central to this effort is the concept of key value memory, which we formalize. The basic idea is that inputs, memoranda, transformed into two distinct representations, keys and values, which are both stored in memory. The keys represent the addresses, whereas the values represent the content. And this is almost identical to what we're doing here in the CTM. The brainish words are pointers to the broadcasted chunks in memory. So I said that all the processors were storing all the broadcasted chunks in memory. That was their global dictionary. They can actually, that word is stored at the beginning of that chunk, actually. And if it's given that word later on, it can very easily look up the chunk and get the meaning in its dictionary of that word PT. So very similar to what was going on here in the CTM. And we can think of the word as the key, the addresses, and the meaning to be what they're calling the value or the content over here. And then they argue that memory and the brain follow similar principles, and they're proposing a division of labor, key storage system, and value storage system. And by connecting these ideas to key value memories, we can begin to understand what makes memory in the brain computationally powerful. Okay, so that's, for me, was very, very interesting to see this paper. Okay, and brainish words and labels continue to evolve and build on earlier ones. So when the CTM toddler falls and skins its knee, it will build on, well, it'll have the feeling of self for the knee, and it'll now develop a more subtle kind of pain, a nuanced pain called skin knee pain, which will get labeled into its model of the world. And one can see consequences of mislabeling and some confirmation from human experience. So if the CTM could experience Cotard's syndrome, it's a syndrome when people think they're dead, if it labeled itself as dead by some inappropriate labeling. So, okay, another one is the body integrity identity disorder. Some people think that one of their limbs, like their leg, doesn't belong to them. And they often go to doctors in the US. I know no doctor will cut off your limb, but they want to have that done. Some will go to Mexico, have it cut off, come back. Even though they're crippled, they feel happier. And it's partly that limb did not feel as part of them. It was labeled in their model of the world as not self. And then there's the opposite. When you have your limb that's been amputated, people will still feel pain or itching. And that in the label, in the model of the world, or in our CTM, will still have the label self. So the CTM could experience phantom limb syndrome and delusional disorders like paranoid, thinking its best friend is a spy, and so forth. Okay, so now let's go to more or less giving you the idea of how to formalize, but let's go a little further. So formal definition, a brainish word may be viewed as a pointer to a broadcasted chunk or nil. Okay, so that's how we formalize that. We have the word there and the meaning. A brainish sequence is a sequence of at most 10 brainish words. Here's the inspection, what we mean by inspection. CTM inspects a broadcasted chunk whenever all processors simultaneously receive and examine the chunk's content and unpack all the words that appear in the gist. Okay, that gist is maybe 10 words, and they have to unpack them. And unpacking a brainish word means retrieving its meaning. So you have to go to a dictionary, retrieve its meaning, and examining its components. And unpacking a word will recapture its meaning, its gist, its weight, and auxiliary information. Okay, thus inspecting a broadcasted chunk means all processes recapture the meanings of the words appearing in the gist. And now we give our working axiom. This is a working axiom, which we call the inspection axiom. And we say inspecting a broadcasted chunk evokes a unique subjective experience. And the intensity and valence of the evoked experience will depend on the weight W. And this axiom is an inductive axiom. We first talk about the primal axiom. Inspecting a primal broadcasted chunk evokes in CTM a unique primal subjective experience. That's our bottommost turtle with intensity and valence depending on W. And the evolved experience, inspecting a broadcast chunk with evolved gist G. So now it's a built up from words that have been looked at before, evokes a unique fusion of the subjective experiences evoked by the meanings of those multimodal words in G. And the intensity and valence, again, depends on W. So we'll now define conscious awareness in CTM to arise when CTM pays both conscious attention to the chunk and actually does much more, goes and inspects that chunk and essentially relives some of the experiences that it had when it developed that brainish language. And so the global broadcast axiom and the working inspection axiom will say that conscious awareness in CTM evokes a unique, unitary subjective experience. That's our theorem. Okay, now as CTM becomes consciously aware of more and more broadcasted chunks, the model of the world processes may call attention to this fact with a weight, very high value. And the word PT that points to the broadcasted chunk that calls attention to this becomes a brainish word for consciously aware or simply conscious. The model of the world labels CTM and the model of the world with the word PT or conscious. And when CTM inspects a broadcasted chunk with labeled sketch, CTM is conscious, CTM will experience by axiom A1 and A2 a unitary fusion of the subjective experiences evoked by the labeled sketch. CTM will feel itself conscious. This is kindred in spirit to neuroscientist Michael Graziano's attention schema theory. It's also kindred in spirit to philosopher Daniel Dennett's view of consciousness. And so, okay, I just want to leave this here. And now we've gone through the review of the conscious Turing machine. We've defined conscious attention, conscious awareness, and now I want to look at alignment with other theories of consciousness. So this is the elephant in the room. And so there are many theories of consciousness. You heard about IIT this morning. The CTM obviously aligns with the global workspace theory or the more extensive neuronal workspace theory of Dehaene and Chandron, Nakash, and others. It's sort of almost built in to align with those theories at a high level. We're not talking about which of the neural correlates they are. And it aligns, as I mentioned, very closely with attention schema theory. Our model of the world is a little bit like the attention schema of Graziano. But there are other models of consciousness, and here are some of the major models of consciousness, and we have predictive processing. And CTM aligns with predictive dynamics, and models of the world really align with predictive processing. It's a very similar notion, the cycles of prediction, feedback, and learning. The embodied, embedded, enacted, extended mind theories, well, CTM sensors and actuators and certain processors align with having embodied and active experiences. CTM's interaction with the outer world is an embedded and active, or like that, those experiences. CTM's allowing off-the-shelf long-term memory processors. If you noticed in my picture, I had lots of different processors. I had Wolfram Alpha, and I had, I think I had ChatGPT and all those. So that aligns with the extended mind theory of consciousness of Clark and Chalmers. And we also believe it aligns with IIT. There's enormous feedback and interconnections in the CTM, and we claim it has hi-fi. So it has, in terms of the measures of integrated information theory, it has hi-fi, and it aligns with the extended reticular thalamic activating system and free energy principles. It's nothing to preclude CTM from having processors that function as the ERTAS. And in fact, I can take the CTM model and flip it around, and you will see it looks very much like Friston's usual model of free energy principle. And evolutionary theories of consciousness of Eva Jablonka, which talks about the global workspace model in evolution, and Nick Humphrey, which talks about the model of the world coming from evolution. And our paper in archive does address these connections, these alignment. But I also want to address the global workspace versus IIT. And we've heard about IIT this morning. I'm almost done. And I want to say that these two theories are a little bit in loggerheads. I know they had a collaborative interaction. But one theory is proposing that consciousness is happening at the front of the head, the front of the brain, and the columns here. Whereas IT, as you heard this morning, is really proposing that because of their model, consciousness is really happening in the back of the head, the back of the brain here. And so you could ask, how can we align with both of these theories? Well, one way we can align with these different theories is we're not predicting any particular place where these features are happening. We're just saying that these functionalities are part and parcel of the CTM, and we're not predicting where that's happening in the brain. CTM is not a model of the brain, but it is saying we do have this functionality.
Just a quick comment. We're slightly over time, so just to maybe leave a couple of minutes for questions.
Right. Okay, so I'm not going to go to test of consciousness, but there is a paper out now that says you should look for a number of these theories for a test of consciousness. We've looked at Kevin Mitchell's 15 times 3 questions about whether real theory should encompass, and we've answered them from the CTM. And the conclusions is we have a simple model, clearly buildable, at a high level. It exhibits and explains phenomena associated with human consciousness. It aligns and integrates with underlying principles of theories of consciousness. It addresses Kevin Mitchell's questions. And so we're going to conclude AI consciousness is inevitable. Thank you. And I know you were very patient there. Thank you. So can I get out of here?
Thank you very much, Lenore. Questions?